like 10 minutes.
Oh, really?
Hey, are you on the phone? Okay. Andrew, are you on the phone? And then Yarrow, are you on the phone?
Yes.
Great. For folks on the phone, just please make sure that you're muted when you're not speaking. Thanks. I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Okay, great. Thanks. All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So I'm going to go ahead and call this Special Housing and Homelessness Committee meeting to order. We are noticed today from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. here at City Hall. Let's go ahead and do introductions, starting with assembly members and then invited representatives.
George Martinez.
Zach Johnson.
Karen Bronga.
Scott Myers.
Felix Rivera. And then do we have any assembly members on the phone? All right, not seeing any. Then let's go ahead and go through invited representatives. And if you could please tell us which assembly community council district you are representing or other entity that you are representing. So we'll go ahead and start with you.
Sure. Ken McCarty, District 2, Eagle River, Chugiak.
I'm Matt Duncan. I'm with the Spenard Community Council, and I'm representing Sand Lake, Spenard Community Council, Turnagain, North Star, and a part of Midtown, I think. So just West Anchorage Community Councils.
Jason Bergerson, representing the Midtown Councils.
And then on the phone, I'll go ahead and start with the two folks that I know are there, and then I'll go back to a couple other folks, starting with you, Rachel.
Rachel Reese for South Anchorage.
And then Yarrow.
Yarrow Silvers, East Anchorage.
Thanks. And then Andrew, are you on the phone with us?
I am, yep.
Great. If you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. Andrew Remmerdahl, and I'm here representing the Building Owners and Managers Association, or BOMA. Currently the president of the board of directors, so here's a representative from that group.
Great. Thanks for joining us. And then Sky. All right. Hopefully Sky will be able to join us a little bit later. All right. So thanks for coming today for this second of 3 meetings where we're going to be diving into criteria. Before we get to the resolution, which is going to be shared here imminently, I wanted to just briefly address, two of the things that came up at our last meeting that folks wanted a little bit more clarity on. So one of them was around scope of work for these particular meetings. So the scope of work currently and in the future is going to be very limited, right? This committee isn't going to be tackling all things, and especially this iteration of the committee is not going to be tackling all things related to homelessness. There's a lot of other work going on outside of this iteration of the committee. And by what I mean by this iteration of the committee, I mean the clean slate strategy work that's happening in these specific Housing and Homelessness Committee, in which the invited representatives are here. There's the task forces that are ongoing. There's the regular Housing and Homelessness Committee that's ongoing. There's a bunch of other work that's happening outside of this limited scope. But within this limited scope that we have, there are what I think are really 3 phases of the work. 1.5 of which has really been outlined in the timeline that everyone should have at this point. So we're currently going through the criteria phase of the timeline. We're going to be talking about what criteria for site selection for shelter, and then that phase of the work will end on July 11th, when hopefully the Assembly will have a resolution before it that it will vote on. Then the next phase of the work goes to location. And once we have criteria, then we can really in earnest move on to the discussion around locations. And that phase of the work right now goes through early August. And then the third phase of the work, which really isn't outlined yet, but need to get through these first two phases first, is really about getting that location up and running and making sure it meets the goals of the community, that location. So that is the scope of the work that we are really in, because I know folks, I don't really know the intent behind the statements, but I think folks wanted to make sure that we were focused on our scope and not really creeping into other things, which it's pretty easy to do when you talk about homelessness, is to creep into a lot of different issues. Then second is timeline. So as stated in the resolution, the timeline of the goal for getting the shelter up is November 1st. And as I've also stated verbally, is we at least need to get this thing up by the end of the year. So those are the parameters that I have outlined, whether it's in the resolution or verbally. November 1st through December 31 is the end timeline. Folks have been asking about zoning and conditional use and all those other processes. And while those are important processes to consider, Title 16, and in particular the emergency shelter provision, in which the Anchorage Health Department director is able to, through emergency declaration in Title 16, help get a shelter up and running, is realistically the only way any shelter, period, would get up and running by the end of this year, while all of the other processes are ongoing. There's realistically and feasibly no other way that a shelter would get up and running by the end of this year, considering some of these processes, conditional use, rezoning, can take months and months and months, right? So any discussion on some of those facets, I know were part of the discussion last week at our meeting on Wednesday. Any discussion on that before we get started on criteria? For folks on the phone, easiest way to get on in the queue is to text me while my phone survives. It has about 5% charge left, so it might die soon. If it does die, then the best way to get into queue is just to be rude and interrupt. That's the best way for you to get into the queue, which don't worry about being rude. So with that, I'll open it up, see if there's any discussion before we move on. All right, just pausing a second. All right, I'm not seeing any, and I don't know if folks on the phone have my phone number to text or not. So just in case you all don't, I'll just email it to you all right now. But it is my same phone number that's in my signature line.
Excuse me, so I'm just a random member of the public, so can I
Hi, sir.
have one question?
Yeah, actually, sir. So there is going to be an opportunity at the end of our meeting for audience participation. So I have you flagged. I don't know your name, sir, but I do have you flagged as someone who wants to participate at the end of our meeting during audience participation. And sort of like we did last time, we actually had audience participation a little bit earlier in our meeting so that we can hear from any members of the public before we dived into the work. So I imagine we'll do some version of that today where we'll have audience participation a little bit earlier before we close. So I appreciate you wanting to engage, and I have you flagged as someone who, when we get to audience participation, we'll get to you, sir. So with that, and I'm not seeing any other discussion or anyone texting me, we're going to go ahead and move on then to the meat of our discussion, which is on criteria. So just a quick reminder of the categories of criteria that I mentioned at our last meeting. And actually, while I'm doing that, if we can go ahead and share the draft resolution. So at our last meeting, I mentioned some categories of criteria based on the 2021 and 2022 work on criteria. So those included things like site characteristics, adjacent uses, cost factors, proximity to services, client safety, neighborhood safety and mitigation, aesthetics, and accommodations. I did an exercise where I just categorized everything into different buckets. After the discussion that we had last week, which was really, for me, my interpretation of that discussion was, yes, we do need to set up some basic criteria. Some of the criteria really are more criteria for operations and operational that maybe don't need to be part of site selection criteria. And then we did talk a little bit about site selection criteria, and folks had different opinions on that. I think for today, so I came up with this draft resolution as a starting point for the discussion. I'm going to walk through it. After I walk through it, then we'll get into the discussion. And what I want to do for the discussion is I want to formalize, we can have some open discussion, but once we get to a certain point, I am going to ask for a formalized process where we will have motions, seconds, and voting, in which all members will be able to vote. And then that way it will help me to fine tune this resolution and the work that we are doing. So with that, let me go ahead and walk through this starting point resolution. So first, I just wanted to note sort of the very, speaking of scope, the very fine box that this resolution imagines. And for folks who are online, this resolution is posted on the website. So if you want to go to the Housing and Homelessness Committee page, it is on there. So yeah, speaking of scope, right, this is a very fine box that we are working in. We're talking about site selection criteria. We're talking about new, permanent, year-round, low-barrier, municipally owned shelter. So that is the box that we are working in with this resolution. Section 1 basically says we support these criteria as outlined below. Sections 2 and Section 3 are the criteria that folks should be really focusing on. Section 2 is what I call screening criteria, and they're all required characteristics of any sites that are reviewed. And I'll go through it in a second. Then Section 3 is additional criteria. So after we screen, what additional criteria do we want to look at to help further refine and make our decisions? And I list those as preferred characteristics. So going back to Section 2, the first bullet in Section 2 talks about zoning. So it mentions zoning in two ways. It mentions that the property must either be zoned PLI or B3, so it either must have that designation already, or 2, have the written support from the Anchorage Health Department director to trigger Title 16 emergency shelter provisions while the property is rezoned. So one of those two screening criteria must be met in order for us to consider a particular property. The next 4 bullets are option A and option B, and that's about square footage. So how large of a property do we want to consider? Option A really is looking at for every 50 individuals, then this minimum square footage needs to, we need to have this minimum square footage. If we go with option A, then you can imagine 100, 150, that multiplier effect. Option B really splits that rather than the multiplier effect to looking at specifically 50 person, 100 person, 150 person. 150 person, the reason why that's the max there is that's what's in our municipal code, is that a shelter that is a permanent year-round shelter, maximum occupancy is, or maximum beds is 150 persons. So that's those bullets. And then the bullet below that is our criteria for timeline. So is this something that can actually be turned on between the timeline that I mentioned earlier, November 1 to December 31? So that's, I think, a realistic criteria that we need to consider. Next criteria below that deals with condition. So if we choose an existing building, which I don't want to presuppose right now that an existing building is going to be chosen, but if we choose an existing building, then the condition of that building has to be fair condition or better, and that has to be determined in writing by. I leave that empty right now because it could either be building safety, some municipal entity, or it could be a third-party contractor that makes that kind of determination. Sure. So I just want to confirm, Taria, are you on the phone? All right, Taria, if you can text me if you're on the phone and if you're here officially representing the coalition in this work. Okay, can you? I will take a pause in a minute, and I will get you the number that you need for to get on the phone, if that's your intent, is to be the official representative for the coalition here. Let me finish going through this, and then I'll take a pause to do that. So then the criteria below that talks about, again, if we're doing an existing building, then the property has to be one of three things: either municipally owned, actively for sale, or not listed, but we have in writing that the owner is interested in selling. Because what I want to do is make sure that whatever we look at in terms of facilities are actually realistic. I think oftentimes we get, for all the good reasons and good intention, we get buildings or suggestions sent to us that I think probably would not meet that criteria. They're not municipally owned, they're not for sale, and the owner is not interested in selling to us. So I think that is a criteria that will help smoothen that process. And then the last criteria is something that we talked about at our last week's meeting, which is around cost. What kind of cost do we want to set as a criteria of anything more than that? And realistically, that's not something that we're going to be able to afford to get stood up by the end of the year. Then quickly, let me go through the other section, which is the additional criteria after the screening and preferred characteristics. And there are just 4 in this one. So talking about buffer zones, and specifically, I left it just to 3 types of entities for buffer zones: schools, childcare facilities, and playgrounds. Because I know that's something that comes up a lot in our discussions, is the safety of children around these facilities, whether that's a valid argument or not, is something that gets brought up in these discussions. Then the property should be within a quarter mile of public transit. That's a criteria that was in the last few go-arounds. Within 1 mile of some type of food, whatever that we want that to look like. And then the ability to create a visibility buffer. So those are all, again, you'll notice the phrasings are different. Section 2 is all required and must have. Section 3 is preferred and should have. And so those are the 2 sections that I think probably be the heart of the conversation. With that, we're just going to take a quick little break so I can get Taria set up to be on the phone.
That's what you.
Yes.
Oh, that's one of my questions from the.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks.
What on the-
Yeah, I will.
use that.
Awesome. Thank you.
I don't know the answer.
I mean, I'm looking at this shelter plan for another state. And they said each person should have 50 square feet.
Oh, we have.
Seems kind of off.
Well, that's good. So that's a
Maybe.
number. You said ours, you mean like community homes? No, just within.
Maybe that's not bad.
Probably, yeah.
Forward to that. Yeah, here, this is not bad. I mean, that's. Must have this.
Yeah, I went to the,
This is kind of an interesting rule they have.
the
No person may reside in shelters where there are six.
just emergency shelter.
Just so.
Yeah.
You gotta
I
be
believe it.
working to get them out. Neighbor policy.
It's like, how do we get these people jobs? No. That's not what we're doing. That's a different program.
Mhm.
Silly stuff.
Mhm.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Units.
Yeah.
So, it's an interesting space that I started asking, because the staffs
Mhm.
see these.
Turia, have you joined us?
Yes, can I be heard?
Wonderful, you are heard. Thank you.
Marvelous, thank you. Sorry for the delay.
Oh, you're good. All right, so let's go ahead and get back. All right, so that was pretty much my spiel on the draft resolution. So yeah, this is the time where we can open it up for discussion and see what people think, see what additions, subtractions, changes folks want to consider for this resolution. Again, sort of timeline for this scope part of the work. So we're going to go into this today. Then we're going to go into this again on Wednesday. And by the end of our time on Wednesday, I for the purposes of keeping that timeline working, I need to have some type of resolution that I can send to our Assembly Council to get put on the agenda for the June 20th meeting, because the agenda deadline for the addendum is Thursday at 12 noon. So that's the timeline that we're working off of. With that, I will go ahead and open it up for discussion.
So do we have, as we are brainstorming these criteria pieces, do we have some way of putting it up there so we can see it on the board or see it in this manner?
More than just that, or what are you asking for
Correct, because
specifically?
as we're suggesting criteria is to be able to brainstorm these pieces and have them to be able to reflect on. So.
So
do we have a way to do that?
are you specifically talking about like if we were to look at a specific criteria that to have a map on the board to show that criteria, or can you just be a little
We're
bit?
suggesting criteria, different things. So as someone suggests something, can it be written up there on the dry erase board? Or is someone that's going to put it up someplace so that everybody can see these suggestions that are coming up?
Sure. So Mandy, do we have the ability to be able to make, let's do track edits? Okay. So we'll do track edits. Just know that these are all suggestions until we go through the formal process to actually adding them through a motion and a vote. But yeah, we can go ahead and do track edits. And can you go ahead and maximize that? Because it's a little bit small. Did you have anything more specific you wanted to add though? Or was that it?
Oh, I have other things I'd like to add, but it's just for the sake of that process.
Perfect. All right, great. So then I'll go ahead and go to you, Yarrow.
Hi, okay, so I wanted to suggest adding, in the third section, not the pre-selection criteria, but in the shoulds. The property should be sensitive to environmental factors.
Can you explain that a little bit more, please?
So environmental factors, so just like, how the property would affect the surrounding environment or how the surrounding environment would affect the property. And what comes to mind, one of the main reasons why I bring this up is because I know that the Basher Community Council, to them, it's really important that we look at, fire danger and stuff like that. And so I just want to make sure that we have a space open to discuss this.
Got it. Thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
So I still don't know, and forgive me if you've explained it, but how do we know like what the parameters? I don't even know how you would decide what building we were looking for, because I have no idea how much money there might be, and maybe you don't know either, and that's the problem, but I feel like that is going to drive a lot of this. And then, I'm sure because you've done so much and Commission to End Homelessness has done a whole lot, but I'm looking at a emergency homeless shelter plan from California, and it's lining out, how many square feet each person should have and this other site characteristics. So hopefully we can not reinvent the wheel, but kind of look at criteria other places have used.
Yeah, thanks. So on money, yeah, that's something that there is a small group that is looking at money for all of the things that we need to possibly fund by the end of the year. So things like the allowed campsites that the assembly approved conceptually at our last meeting, the emergency cold weather shelter plan for at least the 2023 part of that, October to December. And then, of course, the permanent year-round low barrier shelter. So those are all things which are being looked at. And my hope is that by sometime next month, we will have a better sense of the dollars that the municipality has. And then, in addition, I'm hoping that by next month, we'll also have a better sense of the federal dollars that we can use to possibly leverage local dollars. And then perhaps even by then, there may be some discussions around philanthropic or for-profit dollars. So that's all conversations that in the next month we're going to be having. But for sure, I think the planning and the thinking can't wait until we have the sense of all of the dollars. In terms of the specific building, I think to go back to what I said earlier in terms of the phases of work, right? Right now we're in the criteria phase of work where we are talking about what criteria, regardless of building, regardless of location, that we want to adopt sort of universally wide. And then after that, we will go into our discussions around specific locations. So I know for some folks that might be a little bit awkward, a little bit weird. They want to go straight into the conversation around locations, but that is purposefully not how I designed this activity that we're going through. Thanks. Yeah.
So then I'd throw out there, if we're like trying to figure out square footage, this particular example, a minimum of 50 square feet of personal space allocated for each client, including storage area. So, maybe you could start with how many clients you want and for their sleeping area, 50 square feet. And then, there's other square feet for providers and whatnot. Is that kind of what you're trying to do here? I'm sorry if I don't have it right.
Yeah. Thanks. Yes. So that's one of the things that, there is no, and the coalition has said this in the past, there is no sort of universal standard for how big a shelter should be. So that is something that, we have to come up with. And if that standard that we want is 50 square foot for each client, plus add on to that office space and administration space and client service space and all the other things, then that's, I think, something that we need to be able to calculate and put a number down for as one of the criteria. So I have a couple additional folks in the queue. So I have George, then Taria.
Thank you, Chair. This may be a kind of an informational question, but it'll help me have a better foundation. What is the in the resolution that we're talking about? It's about new permanent year-round low barrier municipally owned shelter. I'm curious about the legal requirements that the municipality has for providing year-round low barrier shelter. What are our current requirements? Does it have to be municipally owned? And can you just help me have a better understanding of the starting point?
Thanks. So the only requirements in code have to deal with emergency cold weather shelter, and we must provide emergency cold weather shelter after it gets below 45 degrees. But beyond that, there are no other requirements in code around permanent year-round low barrier shelter. I think the big reason that we're having this discussion, and I don't want to get into all of that timeline because that could take up hours, but going back to 2020, 2021, 2022, we had the Sullivan Arena open. We had all kinds of other non-congregate and congregate facilities open during the pandemic. Then those facilities closed. And at the same time, Brother Francis Shelter, which at the time was our biggest low barrier shelter, they narrowed their population from 240 down to 75, went back up to 120. So the combination of all of those factors left us in the situation where we are today, where we have 700 unsheltered individuals on our streets. So if we're going to address that, then this is where that discussion emanated from of we need shelter in our community. We've known we needed more shelter in our community, frankly, before the pandemic. We knew that we needed more shelter in our community. So that is I don't know if this is where you're getting at or what your intent is here, but that is the whole rationale why we're having this discussion.
No, thank you. And just to follow up on that, it helps me to have an understanding of the legal requirements, because it also seems that part of the legal requirements that we're looking to have would give us the ability to have abatement, it seems like there's some relationship between the ability to have sheltering and some other steps that we take along the way. So I just wanted to get a better sense of that. It also seems that we don't necessarily have a number of what we mean, because this necessarily doesn't address the numbers that you just described of unhoused, right? This necessarily is not going to resolve all of that. It's going to take a bite out of it to some extent, right? And so we're making this determination based on our discussions and our deliberation, but it's not necessarily based on a legal definition or a legal requirement. Is that fair?
Yes, correct. There is nothing legally that is requiring us to have these discussions and to stand up year-round low barrier shelter. There are legal requirements for us to be able to stand up emergency cold weather shelter.
Thank you.
Okay, so then next I have Taria.
Thank you, Selena Felix. So I'm just going to revisit a little bit of what the Emergency Shelter Task Force kind of put forward before, so we don't have to recreate the wheel, and then you can vote if that's how you want to continue. But the requirements we had for shelter were required the 24/7 access, the 3 meals, the showers to be available, and then also and then this is where I'm not sure if this is something in this group can pass it, but something the coalition is definitely wanting to have at the forefront of the conversation is to require the use of HMAS data entry, that it must have that, because that is what HUD tells us we must use as a system to track those persons that are experiencing homelessness. And then not having the room pit on site, if that is a part of the discussion about shelter. The other thing and Jessica and I are both looking for the exact numbers, but there was something we put across with, it was how many toilets and showers per X amount of people. So I don't have the numbers for you right now, but that should be something to be considered of how many toilets there should be for X amount of people, how many showers there should be for X amount of people, and then laundry services or some type of laundry access for shelter. The other thing I wanted to mention is going back to how many square feet. There was a calculation we looked into. One time the CDC was saying 6 feet between cots, obviously with not having the active high COVID response right now. The Emergency Shelter Task Force had talked about lowering that to 3 feet of space. And maybe that'll help you get your square footage or how big a building needs to be. I hope that was helpful.
Thanks, Tria. Yes, that was helpful. So next, I have a couple other folks in the queue. I have Kevin and then Ken.
Thank you. Looking on page 2, the property should have a 200-foot buffer zone from schools, childcare facilities, and playgrounds. I'm curious on why 200 feet. I guess my thought on that is that we would keep the buffer zones closer to the way that we treat alcohol distribution or marijuana stores. And I don't mean this just because it's not that I'm saying that just because these are, it's specifically because they're low barrier shelters and they're not quite residential. And according to the American Addiction Center, it says that, a national statistic that was done in 2022, it looks like 38% of individuals that are in low barrier shelters either bringing alcohol or things like that into it. So considering that it's a higher than amount of average. And at the Friday meeting upstairs, there was a discussion that there was not going to be restrictions on, or there would be minimal restrictions on potentially on weapons and substance being brought in. So if we're not going to restrict weapons or alcohol within low barrier shelters, then I think we need to be, yes.
Yeah, so I think just in case, for the media, for the members, crossing wires a little bit on things, right? So the discussion that was on Friday was for the sanctioned camps, right? For the allowed camps. That might be
Is that not low barrier?
Yeah, but that's not low barrier shelter. So those specific discussions they're having there might be totally
then I
different
apologize
than
if I'm
what we're
merging
having
those
here.
two. But when I
Yeah.
think low barrier, I think of minimal resistance to entry. And so I would assume those would be more in line with the setbacks and restrictions we established for liquor stores and marijuana distributions. So that's just something I would take into consideration. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I have a plethora of ideas here, and I've spent the past 4 days driving around looking at our shelters that exist currently, different sites where people are going to. And as we all don't want to put the sled in front of the dogs team, So as we look at shelters, I think a significant thing is an exit plan. So are we building a permanent structure or a permanent structure type thing, or do we have ability to take it down once this hopefully transition of and it's all over the country, the increase because of since 2017, but especially with COVID. So as we mitigate these different reasons why individuals are coming into Anchorage and it's increasing our homeless, so too as the numbers drop, the availability for or the need for shelters, is that going to also be dropping to we have the shelters already in place? So with that, it's also like the low barrier and where individuals fit in that process. As Saturday, I was around looking at different places and I got to witness our mobile crisis team, Crisis Now, respond to an incident. And I used to be a psychiatric evaluation team in LA when I was working on my first master's degree. And so seeing that dynamic there, if someone is at a very low area, where is that barrier at? And what kind of support systems exist in our community where maybe they need to go to a Crisis Now facility rather than stepping them into this shelter facility? And then what's been brought up by people in the shelters as well as a number of others is that if that person is coming in and they're not in good space, that it's very intrusive to bring them into the shelter, that people in the shelter don't feel safe because that person is coming off of drugs, a lot of anger, yelling, different types of transference things that is triggering people to anxiety. So as we look at shelters or different structures, is there, for those people that are not in good space, but they're not fitting of crisis now, harm to self or others, but they're not in good space, what's the structure that they would be in this room, structure, whatever it may be for that purpose and not in the milieu for other type of, facilities?
Thanks. In terms of, so I have a couple folks in the queue. I have Yarrow and then Jason. In terms of permanency, I'm not sure this resolution is necessarily going to address permanency. Certainly, I would love the idea of eventually opening a shelter and then years down the line closing a shelter. I think the reality of that is going to depend on all kinds of things, factors outside of the control of this committee, of when and if we get to eventually shut down the shelter. I'd love to be able to get to success where we can shut it down, but certainly the phrasing of this resolution speaks to permanency, right? Speaks to the shelter being a permanent fixture for as long as it's needed. And we know Brother Francis Shelter has been needed for decades, right? And more than that, we know that more than that is needed. In terms of use of space, I'll chew on that a little bit of how that might be translated into a specific criteria, because that's the work that we're doing here is the criteria. Did you have, go ahead.
Appreciate that. I think it is important that we have an exit criteria plan. So whether the numbers exist, the needs there, whatever that piece there, so that we know that we're effective in helping with the shelters. And maybe the need has gone up, and so there's need for more shelters. But if it goes down, we have that already as a criteria of what it looks like. We all experienced the earthquake. My office was taken out. So I went from a very large office to 800 square feet with a bunch of staff and how to make that there. That was a mass unit, and I was telling my staff that it's a temporary place. But what do we have for our criterias of an exit numbers and stuff like that?
Thanks. And that actually jogs my memory, and then I'll get into the queue. So when the assembly considered, this would have been back in the day when the assembly was looking at the Tudor and Elmore Navigation Center. One of the, I wouldn't necessarily call it criteria, probably just requirements that we had of that facility in terms of the longevity of that facility was that it would, once it achieved functional zero, then we'd be able to shut down the shelter side of that facility. Realistically, functional zero is, I won't get into what functional zero means, but functional zero is realistically years and years and years down the line for us to achieve that for single adults. But that is something that, a definition that we have used in the past. I'll go to Yarrow.
Hi, so I just wanted to respond to the coalition a little bit ago, talking about the HMIS data and stuff like that. And so when I talked about last time about navigation center-specific legislation, a lot of the legislation that I'm finding online for other cities and other places includes things like that. So like this one is in California, and it's actually, the legislation includes, it has a system for entrant information regarding climate status, blah, 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 and then the HMIS system. So again, I just want to throw out there, how important I think that's going to be to work on some type of navigation center legislation alongside getting a facility online.
Thanks, Yarrow. Next, I have Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I spent quite a bit of time while I was traveling last week and on the phone with Chelsea, the alternate for Midtown, trying to brainstorm around how we advance the kind of the outline you laid out at last week's meeting. So the handout that I put together, and hopefully everybody has it, was just meant to start at a very high level and put sideboards on some of these open questions. How much money do we have to work with? It's really hard to go through this process and not say, we've got $1.5 million, or we've got 5 million, or we've got an unlimited budget. I don't want to waste everybody's time or participate in a process that's just going to be a wish list. Are we going to put some reasonable sideboards on the whole thing? We need a number sooner than later. Are we going to limit the activities that we're considering viable to those that are within the existing zoning, that are fit within the Title 21 planning, land use policies, et cetera? Title 21 has some, Title 16 has others. They relate to neighborhood protections and mitigation. Are we going to assume that this winter's project is not, as you, I think, started to allude to earlier, going to be the product of some rezone or wish list or last minute buy? I worked in government for 30 plus years. If this is going to be more than a certain dollar amount, it's going to go through a public process, public procurement, hearings. And if we don't limit this to first PL1 land that the city already has, is vacant, has utilities, has electricity, and then secondarily the B3 lands, which the long-range plan really doesn't even consider viable for shelters. It focuses specifically on PL1 land with a conditional use. If we can at least collapse the environment down to a smaller box, then I think we could go through site characteristics, adjacent uses, cost factors, all of the items that you laid out last week.
Thanks. Yeah, I need to chew on that, and I might ask you to repeat your comments. I'm going to go ahead and move on to George.
Thank you, Chair. Just two points to articulate. One, it goes back to the question that I asked kind of before about just the legal needs, and why does it have to be municipally owned? It doesn't? Okay.
So yeah, so I'll go back to what I said earlier, right? So the way that this resolution is crafted, it's a very narrow box. It imagines the following things: that this is one, that these are site selection criteria; two, that this is a permanent shelter; three, that this is a year-round shelter; four, that this is a low barrier shelter; and then five, that this is a municipally owned shelter. It imagines those things. Is there absolutely opportunity for a nonprofit, for-profit, philanthropic, you name it, organization to come in and set up their own shelter outside of everything that we're discussing? Heck yeah, there is that opportunity. But those conversations, one, right, I'm only hearing whispers of one possible thing that's happening for families, not for single adults, which is largely what this envisions, is for single adults. So then what's left, right? If someone else isn't going to step into that void, then here we are having to step into the void. So I don't know if
Sure. Yeah, no, it does help me, because it just raises the point of the two different conditions that I think I'm hearing, which are owned and the difference between permitted or operate or licensed, right, to operate, right? And so we licensed the Third Avenue, Brother Francis, right? That was not owned by the municipality. Is that accurate?
So first, I want to say, not licensed. No, we didn't license the Brother Francis shelter, but yes, we did own it. And then I think there's what was a lease agreement with Brother
To
Francis
operate it?
for them to operate it. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what we're envisioning, right? Because I know a lot of people like to use the turn of phrase of this is going to be a municipally run shelter, and I just want to quash that idea. This is not going to be a municipally run shelter. This is going to be municipally owned shelter,
Prospectively,
but
potentially a municipally owned shelter.
potentially a
Right.
municipally owned shelter, but run by some third party.
Well, I just think that the clarity is really important because I don't hear the distinction at this point. And so I think that distinction is really important because I don't think that we're in the business of doing this well in terms of running these things well. And I think that experts should do what they do well as best as they can. So I would just put that out there, and I just wanted to really think about it. And potentially it's the wording of that we want to reconsider, because I don't think it, I think when I read this or if I hear this publicly, it may limit the way people interact who may or have the philanthropic or the civic kind of wherewithal to step into that fold with us if we ask a different invitation. The other point I would just flag is something that Mr. Cross mentioned. I just think that potentially the uniformed approach to the numbers that we currently use in code might be a better way to address some of the numbers, so that we already, like, I would be interested in knowing, what do we use a 200-foot buffer for zone today? Or do we generally use a 500-foot buffer similar to the way we describe with marijuana licensing and stuff? What is the general code or numbers that we use in code that is more uniform, so this appears to be a little arbitrary? Because I also think about 1 mile of food, and I wonder why that is 1 mile versus, is there a site criteria that has a number that works where it worked? And are we trying to apply a solution to an area that we need 1 mile versus a criteria that has a different number? And so I think the best that we can do to align anything to code that exists and to current numbers really helps to create create trust and or give an explanation of where these ideas may come from, with the footnotes and that sort of thing, so that there's more background information. That's probably informational, but I'm just curious about that, because as I read these things, I think somebody may have had a site in mind that these criteria fit versus a criteria that helps to define a site. And that would be my only flag to raise. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I can certainly tell you that developing this particular criteria, I did not think of any particular site when I developed this criteria. And also just want to add that this is a discussion point. And so it's particularly helpful for folks, to be specific in your recommendations, because, come Wednesday, right, we are going to be really getting into the nitty gritty of finalizing this in some form, some fashion. So there's a lot that has to happen between now and Wednesday, and looking forward to engaging in that.
Just off the specificity, if I may, similar to where we use a number foot for buffer zones in code, I would want to have that uniformed. And we, in our resolution that we passed, we talked about with respect to the allowed camps, we did highlight that within a 1/4 mile of public transportation. And that also is something that we've identified in the other ordinance that we're talking about with respect to that, because that seems like a best practice and it's a uniform standard. So I would then also just drill down into those other two and kind of make sure that we have a framework for why that parallels those two other frames. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, next I have Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Part of my follow-up is to Mr. Martinez's question. I think there are uniform standards within the code in 2107, 070, and 2150, 420, and 2105, 055. And there's also minimizing neighborhood impact commitments for shelters and municipalities in 16-125-065. I'm sure there's more sections, but those were the ones that came up quickly in a search. I agree. I think we need to be uniform. I think there are a few other items on the list that's being accumulated, like proximity to services is not on the list. I would place that at a higher priority than proximity to food.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Just a follow-up question to the ownership question that I had before around, and I asked about Brother Francis. What's the status of that building? Do we still own that building? And is the operation happening out of there still under our charter or our permission, if you will?
So yes, I believe it is still a municipally owned building, and I am not sure of the terms of the lease. I imagine that it's probably like an extremely long-term lease.
Sure. And then just to follow up to that would be, you mentioned the response to the pandemic in terms of the number of beds or people that they had and provided shelter for. I think most people, as evidenced by the barbecue we had this past weekend, where people were using ketchup bottles and they were sharing, and people weren't wearing masks, and they're kind of just being past the pandemic. What is the number today at the Brother Francis or that facility, and is it less than what we want, and do we have the ability to turn it back up?
Thanks. So the number is 120, and that is a number that Brother Francis Shelter feels like they can maintain and they can adequately staff. I would say that we as a municipality, I do not believe that we have the ability to ramp that number up. That number is something that the Brother Francis Shelter owns. So we can ask them to ramp them up, but I do not believe that we have the ability to force them to ramp it up. Thanks. Taria?
Thanks so much. If I can just speak to just really quickly about the increasing any shelters for capacity. I believe Baptist Social Services is sitting there, but one of the things the coalition has done is has truly supported shelters and what is the best practice for providing those services, especially as we are all housing focused and moving to a housing first posture. So having more people inside a shelter doesn't mean that you're going to get necessarily more or better services. So I think Brother Francis has looked at their census, and they really have done that work of saying, hey, this is how we can provide the best services to the people that are most vulnerable in our community. And I think as we look at future shelters, we should also keep that in mind, which is why it's wonderful to see here in this resolution that you're looking at smaller shelters, which isn't always about the square footage sometimes as far as like delivering those services. But the reason I got in the queue was to talk about shelter licensing. And so I would be remiss if I didn't say that whatever shelter we're looking at would also fit all the criteria that is in shelter licensing that was passed this January by the Assembly. And if I get it wrong, I apologize. So all of those criteria in there, and there's like a short list at the very front or a checklist there on the website. So those things the shelter should adhere to also. And then my final comment is going to be around ADA compliance and making sure that there is ADA as far as bathrooms and accessibility for those that are needing that those accommodations. Thank you.
Thanks. Want to note for the record that we've been joined by Randy Soltz, and then I have Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As far as facilities go, are we only looking at one low barrier site, or kind of as Yarrow was talking, are we truly looking for the smaller, more regionally dispersed sites that focus on women and children, focus on couples or families, and maybe aren't as troublesome as what the low barrier shelter clientele may be? And with that, certain sites that have been identified that have gotten criticized because they're close to a police department or a busy intersection or other things become benefits for the subset of the clientele. If it's women and children or couples and safety is a big consideration, I'd rather camp by the police department than way out in Eagle River. So,
Thanks for that. So I'll respond to that, and then I have Matt in the queue next. So in terms of how many shelters, so I can only tell you sort of me personally where I am right now, but the process, then I'll talk about the process. So me personally, where I am right now, I think 150 person low barrier shelter for single adults is the need that we have in our community, and that's what I'd like to eventually get to. And then in terms of the process envisions really any number of things. I mean, if you look at the way that I crafted this resolution, the process envisions we can complete that puzzle in any number of ways as long as we get to that 150 number that I think we're trying to get to, and consider costs and all of these other factors. So I would say no, there isn't a set sort of predetermined number of shelters, because I know that that's been a large part of the discussion, is the idea of multiple shelters. I think with that comes the reality that we need to also be thinking about costs as it relates to setting up multiple shelters around town and what that does to our costs. And then I think you might have had a second point, but I didn't take note of it. So my apologies. Did you have any follow-up on that?
thank you, Mr. Chair. It really comes in the absence of a budget to the secondary criteria and how do we progress this process. If we don't know how much we have to assume it's not enough or very little. So that means even though there isn't an obligation that it be municipally owned legally, I think it forces us to not even waste the time at this point of going through an RFI or an RFQ to identify lands for sale. I think we need to look at primarily the PL1 land that has repeatedly come up. The land near the police department at Elmore, the land where the old Native hospital was. And there's probably 4 or 5 other, but smaller sites that include the basic criteria that are close to plug and play. If we assume that either pallet shelters or even cheaper, the school district relocatables can be moved to those sites and possibly even become the year-round continuum of service, 6 or 8 relocatables on a 5-acre parcel. If it's the Midtown site, which I really hope nobody looks at because that used to be residential and really should be returned to it. But school district relocatables and other utility services at the right site with the right fencing and visibility controls could also become the sanctioned campsites when things warm up. They would be known sites. They would be established within our reasonable budget. And hopefully this committee and this process leads to identifying more than just one. We don't want another Sullivan Arena situation, but I don't think we want to jar the public into thinking that there's either going to be too many or too few, and focus whatever this bomb is on one location or one neighborhood. I think we need to convince them that the intent is to follow all of the rules that already are in play, put restrictions on it for budget, maximize the use of existing property, and locate certain services either near or far away from the adjacent property's conflict. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Next, I have Matt, Taria, and then Karen.
Thank you, Chairman. So what we've spoken about so far, we've did some discussing about should we come up with what we want first or should we come up with what we can afford first? And we've had some talk about whether or not the free market was going to fix this for us. In my neighborhood, the free market has not fixed this for us at all in any way, shape, or form. There are people with acute addiction and mental health problems camping on the street that I live on right now, in the community that I live in, and the people that I'm here speaking for live in right now. So we do need this shelter. And the studies have already been done that say what the economies of scale would be. And while in my mind, 150 people seems like way too many, if people with bigger brains than I say 150 people is where it's at, then I believe them. The big concerns that I would like to see on this document that we're working on right now is a ratio of staff to client. That may be beyond the scope of what we're picking right now, because that's the people that we're going to hire to run this facility. And then speaking in line with what the gentleman next to me was talking about is what rooms do we have inside of this facility for segregation of the vulnerable groups? Because this is not a facility for a single mom with 2 kids, but it is a facility that a single mom with 2 kids might have to spend 24 hours in. There's other facilities for her and her children, but this is an emergency facility for people in crisis. And when you are dealing with a population that what is 100% of the members of this population are in crisis, you're going to have people who are in acute crisis that need to be segregated because they're screaming, they're taking off their clothes, they've got other problems that I witness on my street now that I would like to have in a facility away from me. Then already addressed by phone was the restroom ratio, the shower ratio, and the secure belongings caches. Because having a place for people to put their stuff is a great way to have people have stuff. And if their stuff is safe, then they feel safe. And that's where the economies of scale comes in. And the relocatable buildings, in order to staff a relocatable building for 12 people, you would require more than 12 staff members, which no longer makes sense. You could just give everybody a job and buy them a nice house. That's all I have to say.
Thanks. Then next I have Taria.
Thank you. My original comment about getting in the queue was speaking to proximity to services. So I think the coalition has spoken numerous times. I just want to put it back on the record that we do not want to advocate for any more concentration of services. If you have a shelter, the services should be provided inside the shelter. And that goes back to even the shelter licensing document that I was speaking about. It talks about having housing focus and how you do that, how coordinated entry is a requirement. And then it also talks about, to speak to the last speaker, the ratio for staffing, which is the 1-30 or the 1-50 ratio. So when we're looking at, the services that will be given, I think that when you get to that section in shelter licensing, it says that you could also offer more. And your shelter, almost every shelter I know of, also acts as a navigation point. And if you had your shelter leaders, they would tell you that when they're talking to persons experiencing homelessness, there is that natural navigation that happens in that arena when you are providing those services. Thank you.
Thanks, Tria. Next, I have Karen.
I just wanted to remind people that the Tudor Elmore site, that is not an active police station. It's an evidence storage area. They come downtown for their shift to check in, check out. So, visually, it might be like these little mobile police stations that no one's ever manned in, and it kind of looks all right. The other thing that I was going to talk about is, we could go in circles and circles, but you want to come out of here with some square footage. And so we can look at that. You were going to mark down maybe 500-foot buffer from schools. And I wondered if within this criteria, previously you talked about it cannot be in these neighborhoods. We're not disincluding any neighborhood at this point, right? Or area of town?
Thanks. As currently drafted, there are no specific criteria to distance between shelter and neighborhoods.
And then I had one more question for Catholic Social Services. Is the transition center that you built, is it being utilized fully where it is? Because Brother Francis is there. It seems like they're taking care of their clients. Would it make sense that this shelter was somewhere near their navigation center? So,
through the chair, is your question, or I should probably call microphone.
Yeah.
Thank you. Could you repeat the question for me, please?
well, I was just wondering, it's a beautiful facility. Are you getting adequate clientele coming into that navigation center? Or would it make sense that we were looking at least a smaller shelter that would be close by, that we could work in tandem with you, use that navigation center as part of the shelter?
Thank you for the question.
Identify yourself,
And
please.
my name is David Rittenberg, Senior Director, Adult Homeless Services, Catholic Social Services. I believe the question is, as far as the number of clients that are coming through, we're seeing on average about 80 to 100 people per day, which I would consider adequate clientele. We're pretty busy down there, which is good. That's what we're intended to be. We do probably have some capacity. I think our busiest day was 130, 140 clients, and that was a pretty busy day. But again, the staff there did a great job, and we got through it, got everyone served, showers, navigation, all of those types of things. So that being said, I do not believe the Third Avenue Resource Navigation Center would be able to meet the need for the entire community. But we are looking at things such as expanding our hours potentially. We just opened up in February and we wanted to start small and expand out. And so there is some opportunity to add some capacity there with some planning. It's not a switch that we could turn on and make happen overnight, but it's discussions that we are currently having and knew that we were going to have and plan to have prior to us opening, knowing that we would probably find some space to expand our hours a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, then next, so the next few folks I have in the queue, Ken, Randy, George, Yarrow.
Okay, thank you. Again, a plethora of ideas and so on. So to piggyback on what Mr. Martinez was saying about the municipal ownership, and I would prefer that we have a, oversight or whatever phrase there that opens it up. I have the magic wand, as we all wish we had that. But I think that the old Native Hospital site, the 15 acres, is a prime spot, as you're describing different descriptors there. But one should be added to is close to a business park where people could go to for employment. And that area there has lots of businesses down there, and there could be a need for additional employees. And I think that there is down there, as well as maybe incentives for businesses to come in and have, whatever incentive type thing for employees from the homeless. So we're not only just taking care of the homeless, but taking the need of workforce or navigating them into that. The other piece is, I think, being careful of redundancy of programs. So having a central site is nice, but having maybe a structure that is for just to integrate them to locations, transport them to the different services there. But if something could happen there, but let's not be too redundant. Something that's come up over this past week, number of interesting suggestions that the base, and I'm not saying the base has obligated themselves to this, but there are these mobile units already there that are sitting doing nothing. And they had quite a few military people come through, and now they're sitting there. I don't know if we've asked the base if they're available to be used. We also know about the tiny homes. The idea of let's say the 15 acres, if let's say, hypothetically, I haven't designed this, but saying, okay, you divide it up into 5-acre sections, and one section is for women, because we do have individuals that are being, perpetrated upon, and that's not appropriate. So that for them to feel safe in that little area there, that they have the units, but they have a safe zone for men, and then for that navigation area or whatever it may be, which may also include those individuals that are not in good space. So they're not intruding upon these other areas there. That's my magic wand.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Just on the JBEAR units, that is a discussion that's quickly evolving. Hasn't really hit the full assembly yet, but is a quickly evolving discussion, particularly for housing. I don't think we want to use those units for shelter, but we want to use those units for housing. And so it's all a part of the same equation. Okay, so then next I have Randy.
Great. Thank you. Those military units, they're looking at one point in Independence Park, and there's questions as to the integrity of them. But I'll just say something's better than nothing. Yeah. So they may need some work, but anyway, as long as they can survive the move. Just a quick comment. I like how Section 3 has should statements. Section 2 has must statements. So I just want to caution against painting yourself into a corner where you don't have a way out. So always have a way out. Hey, must. But the assembly could override, something like that. Leave yourself a way out if you need it. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and I guess just to reiterate, because I think we had this discussion a little bit before you got here, but sort of Section 2 we're seeing as what are the things that for initial screening of locations, when we get to the locations discussion, these are criteria that we really feel like these must meet. And then Section 3 is sort of beyond that. What are the things that would be nice to have as additional ways for us to help us make a wise decision? But certainly I take your point to heart. So next I have George, then Yarrow, then Turia, then Jason.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm not sure which section this would go in, but the difference between the property should be within a quarter of a mile of public transportation and compelling operators to provide transportation. I think we have to have what I describe as clinical transportation services to any of the sites, so that that is the burden is not just put on to the people mover, for example, but obviously it's a criteria, but these are in the shoulds too. And so either the criteria must be within a quarter of a mile, but I also think that we should be working with operators to provide dedicated shuttle or transportation services to any of the sites that we're talking about. One of the challenges is that people have meetings or appointments in different parts and different places, and they're often told how to get there. And I think that can help alleviate people from having dangerous street encounters, but also making sure that people are getting to some of those services that might be off-site. And putting that pressure on people mover to get vulnerable people to where they need to be might be a little too much, and maybe better adequately addressed in the contract negotiations for the operation. Thank you.
Thanks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through these last three folks that I have in the queue, Yarrow, Turia, and then Jason. And then what I'm going to do is put a pause on this conversation, go to audience participation to see if any audience members have things that they want to add to this. And then we'll finish with any other discussion that folks want to have and some closing. So Yarrow, go ahead.
Yeah, so, I mean, just as part of the conversation also, I think we need to talk about how we will avoid having a facility that bumps up 350 to 500 people every winter like Sullivan has every winter. So if this is going to be a year-round facility, where is our cold weather emergency shelter going to be? Because if this is plans to be both the year-round facility and the cold weather emergency shelter, it's going to go to 500 people every winter. And I don't think that's what we want. So I think we need to have a discussion about that as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I wish there was a way for me to have everyone at all of the meetings that I go to. But yes, that is a discussion that's currently ongoing of emergency cold weather shelter and the various different levers that we can pull for emergency cold weather shelter. I would just invite folks to listen to the recording of the assembly of the regular Housing and Homelessness Committee meeting that was held on June 8th, where we began that discussion. And the levers, just to put it quickly on the record here, for emergency cold weather shelter, we're looking at are things like non-congregate shelter, so hotel spaces. We're looking at possible temporary shelter, so a standalone temporary shelter. That's a lever. We haven't decided what levers we're picking, but that is a lever that is available to us. Another possible lever available to us is asking existing shelter capacity to be increased. We did successfully make that ask to a couple of entities last winter, and we can continue to make that ask to entities this next winter. So those are parallel conversations, but that specific conversation around emergency cold weather shelter is going to be happening in our regular Housing and Homelessness Committee meetings, which are traditionally held the third Wednesday of the month. We bumped this one up just at the request of the administration. So that is when we will talk about emergency cold weather shelter. That's something that we're going to have to figure out and fund. But I appreciate you bringing that up as it's all part of the whole. Next, I have Taria.
Thank you, Felix. So I'm going to probably just mention really quick something that was already mentioned at the last Housing and Homelessness Committee meeting, which was the cost, kind of the last bullet on section 2. The Emergency Shelter Task Force did create kind of a grid about budget estimates. I believe at the task force, Felix talked about $92 a day, but the Emergency Shelter Task Force talked around $100 a day with the 1 to 30 day and 1 to 50 nighttime staffing ratio. So that total for, I think it was 8 months that we had calculated, would have been about 5 million, around 5 million is what it is. I don't want to read all the numbers. Just to operate, and that's operating a shelter. And the shelter cost is the shelter cost, because it's about staffing, not even if you're full or not. So that is kind of where we're at there. And then my other comment was going to be about families, about who we're serving at the new low barrier shelter. So the new low barrier shelter, if wherever it is going to be, should only be for single adults. There is no shelter that I know of, nor that the coalition would be advising to mix families with single adults. So, and for various reasons. So the shelter that would come online would only be for single adults and couples. So if couples wanted to go, and then inside the shelter, the operator would make that decision on if couples stayed together or had to be separated or however that goes. but families, people with children should not be going to that site. The municipality already puts their efforts towards something with Christian Health Associates for emergency cold weather shelter for families, and then we do have 2 family shelters that operate full year round. And for those that don't know, that's the maternal shelter where fathers can't go by themselves, so a single dad, or a 2-parent household, or then Claire House, which is just for mothers with their children. Thank you.
Thanks. Just to confirm, that $100 per day, what was the number of individuals at a shelter? Was that 150?
That assumption was back at the 350.
That was 350. Okay. So would it then be an accurate statement to say that that number would possibly go up? Not sure exactly how much, but it would go up if we were at 150 or 50 or 100, any of those variations?
That is correct. And then also, thank goodness for Jessica in the audience for the quick math. I am not quick. So 8.5 million for the 12 months, if you were using that calculation from the Emergency Shelter Task Force.
Got it. Thanks. Jason, and then we'll go to audience participation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add that, aside from relocatables and the pallet shelters, as the oil industry goes into downturn, there are oil and rig camps that are becoming available, very inexpensive relative to new construction, partly because if you take it away, then it's not their problem anymore. And it may be worth reaching out to some of the large oil and gas companies and their housing operators to see if significant donation might also be available. These shelters are made for cold weather. They are portable and scalable and could, in the long run, maybe past this first winter, become a viable alternative.
Thank you. All right, so with that, we're going to go ahead and move on to audience participation. So I know we had at least one person on the phone. So we'll go ahead and go to the gentleman on the phone first, and then we'll go to other folks in person. And for
You're talking about me, correct?
yes, if that was you that piped up earlier in the meeting, then I am talking about you. So if you can go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I will set a 3-minute timer.
Okay, so my name is Douglas. I have past experience with homelessness. I've been homeless, so I have an insider's viewpoint on this. And I've heard several points that actually struck some serious alarm bells, one of them being the proximity to schools. You have a large population of predators in the homeless. So rather than hundreds of feet, you should be looking at thousands of feet. But primarily, my concern is security. You have, there was a mention of men that have attacked women. Women also attack women. In the large shelter, the large temporary shelter that just closed down over at Sullivan, you had security there, but your security was attacking the residents and was selling drugs to the residents and was covering for rapes and multiple. So obviously security is a huge factor in people's safety. And so that's from my point of view, because I still have acquaintances that are homeless. I would really like to know how you would answer that. That's about all I have at the moment. I do intend to address on the June 20th about mental health care in the homeless communities. I think that rather than worrying about separating these folks out in the populace, they need to be taken off the streets, but that's a different topic altogether. You know, there needs to be actual asylums for them. So that's all I had to say on that.
Great. Thank you for participating. All right. So we're going to go ahead and go to folks in person, and we'll go back to the phone to see if anyone else on the phone would like to participate. So anyone in person who would like to participate, you'll need to come up to a mic, state your name for the record, and then I'll put a 3-minute timer on. Yeah. Yes.
Do I press the button or just?
Yep. Green is what you want.
Hi, my name is Saul Baez. I'm the unaccompanied housing manager at Jaber. I'm in the process of retiring this September. I'm working also with Lionheart Construction. We're looking at Eagle River about the DMV. We're here to provide any assistance that we can. The president of the company allowed me to use our time and resources to provide designs, assistance, recommendations to you guys. Some of the things that I would like to mention is thank you for recording all the meetings and posting them online. I'm gonna try to be brief. I've been looking and hearing at the past meetings, 7 or 8 of the past meetings. They last about 60 minutes or more. That's really helpful information for me to help you save time and not ask the same questions that usually newcomers will be asking. So a few points for you to take into consideration is it's important to have an accountability and compliance inspector on site that goes through these different sites. And again, this is for accountability and compliance to ensure that these sites are being managed to the proper standards. A hotline for either tenants, if we would like to call them like that, or customers, to be able to report any deviancy in this accountability and compliance. There had to be security, especially females, potentially sexual assaults that happens in these sites. So it's really important that, again, accountability and compliance. Something else is we're calling this the emergency cold weather shelter. Have you taken into consideration in the case of an earthquake that affect housing needs, in the case of an emergency, increase in influx of like in 2018? Is this program going to be addressing that, or that will be addressed to FEMA in the case of an emergency like that? Because if it happens in the winter, now you have to address the influx of personnel, just taking these things into account now so we can build it into the proper response and not be reacting to the emergency if that's the case in the next earthquake. Right now, the Small Business Development Center for small business owners have about $59 million for the SSBCI program, which can be used for this to small companies, small businesses that want to help or have business initiative that provide services to this type of program. Not many people is aware of those fundings. I have a meeting with Carlos Machuca and John Bittner, if I'm not, I want to butcher his last name, which is the state director for the Small Business Administration Development Center, and Carlos Machuca will be the local Anchorage Small Business Development Center director right here at the bar. But that funding is available. I believe the funding started becoming available now in March. So again, not many people are aware of that funding that is here to stimulate small businesses that want to target areas of need in the economy, one of them being housing. So just to bring that to everybody's attention. So the lady at the end mentioned the need for square footage. I'm gonna
Actually, sorry, your time's up, sir.
Okay,
but thank you.
You're welcome.
Would anyone else like to participate?
Hi, Chair Rivera and fellow assembly members. I just want a point of clarification. Assemblyman Rivera. So,
Can you
From-
state your name for the record?
I'm so sorry, Hillary Morgan. So in this meeting and then in looking at the minutes and talking to lots of folks who are involved in this issue of homelessness, I'm curious about the overall construct of all of the different groups that are working on this. So if you can just correct me if I'm wrong, that we have the Clean Slate group, there's a sanctioned camp group. The mayor is meeting with business people on how to deal with homelessness in the business sector downtown. You just said that there was like a money group working on money for to pay for this. The Community Behavioral Health Needs Community Task Force just put out their report on June 1st. There's a cold weather shelter group, and then there's an emergency shelter task force. So I'm just curious about what the intersect is of all of these groups working on seemingly some piecemeal stuff. If you could answer that, that'd be great.
Do you have anything else? Great, thanks. Yeah, you're right in that there is an intersection in all of this work. They're all sort of different parts of the equation for how we handle this. And I mean, by and large, that intersection of how all of these different pieces play, it's going to come to the assembly when the assembly has to approve funding for it. And then at that point, that's when rubber meets the road, and the assembly is going to make the decision of what we want to fund and where all of those intersections are going to be in the end. Because in the end, by and large, these things are probably going to be municipally funded or at least leveraged with other funds. So that is where the intersection lies for this group as policymakers. But beyond that, a lot of so the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness and other groups are also involved in several of them, not all of these components, but several of them, and providing some assistance with that intersectionality. But I mean, you're right. There is a lot going on. I will say the last two groups that you mentioned, there is no emergency shelter task force. That group no longer exists, and there is no emergency cold weather shelter task force, which that started as the cold weather task force, transformed into the emergency shelter task force, and now that group no longer exists. But all of the things that they did are on the coalition website. All right. Anyone else like to participate? All right. Go back to the phone. If any other members of the public on the phone would like to participate, it's *6 to unmute yourself. All right, not hearing anyone, then we're going to go ahead and go back to the conversation. So thanks to everyone for participating. So is there any other committee discussion before we close things out on criteria? Go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up on Mr. Martinez's question earlier about distances in the code right now. Establishments like marijuana facilities, it's a 500-foot distance from certain zoning districts except the Chugiak Eagle River Title 21-10. Marijuana establishments are at least 1,000 feet from all of the other following uses, and it lists several facilities. So I think that one is probably closest to what liquor stores and other neighborhood impacting activities use. I think we just need to have staff double check those if we're going to put a limit in. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other discussion before we close things out? All right, not seeing any. All right, so thank you for the discussion. That was very helpful. I'm going to try to incorporate thoughts that folks have into the site selection criteria. And I'm going to incorporate other thoughts into probably some type of second item, talking about operations, because I'm not sure that everything's going to fit neatly into site selection criteria. So in terms of the process from here, we're going to be meeting again on Wednesday, and then this resolution is going to be in final draft state. So there's not going to be any more X's or question marks. That'll all be finalized for us to deliberate. And then I'm going to be asking folks to be prepared on Wednesday with your specific criteria if you want those to be included that weren't mentioned today. Or you might as well just also prepare language for any criteria that you did mention today, just in case it doesn't end up in the final version. And make sure that you have your language finalized as well, because Wednesday is going to be the date for us to do all of that. And then just want to end by announcing to folks that there's going to be a work session on Friday from 9:30 to 11 a.m. on the Navigation Center proposal. That's going to be before the body on June 20th. And then right after that work session, Member Brawley and I will be hosting a press conference to provide further comment on the proposal. I hope to see folks at the work session on Friday. And of course on Wednesday. With that, this meeting is adjourned.
That's what I knew. That's what it's
So we can be emailed. Yeah, I'll make sure that this version is emailed to folks, and then what you'll see on Wednesday